On August 28, 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered an address that has since become a timeless symbol of hope and equality.
I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day
The I Have a Dream speech was witnessed by 250,000 people in attendance on that historic day. Millions more watched on TV and listened through their radios as MLK delivered his powerful message from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Yet, despite its monumental impact, this iconic speech is often surrounded by myths and misconceptions. In today's video, we will uncover some of these misconceptions and strive to present the true version of this historic moment. Let's begin with Number 7, MLK did not lead the protest. Millions around the world wrongly believe that the 250,000 people jammed into the National Mall that day just to listen to Martin Luther King and that he was the one spearheading the protest. In fact, the protest was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, and King was just one of several march leaders. The march was a collaborative effort among what we now call the Big Six of the civil rights movement. They were Philip Randolph, James Farmer, John Lewis, Roy Wilkins, Whitney Young, and Martin Luther King Jr., while the architect of the event was activist Bayard Rustin. Eric Arneson, a George Washington University civil rights movement historian, put it this way: it was King's dream, not his march. Number 6, MLK wasn't the only speaker. Since it wasn't King's march, it is no surprise that he wasn't the only speaker that day. Given the fanfare around that address, many wrongly believed that Martin Luther King Jr. was the only one who took the podium. In reality, he was one in a lineup of 10 and was slotted in as the last speaker. While he wasn't the only speaker, it's true that his address was the main attraction. The only reason he was slotted in last was out of concern that people may leave after he finished speaking. Another interesting fact is that Dr. King, like all other speakers, was only supposed to speak for 4 minutes. However, his iconic speech went on for 16 minutes, going down as arguably the greatest address in history. Fun fact, there was a white speaker. The most prominent white speaker was called the White Martin Luther King. Walter Reuther was the head of the United Automobile Workers, which provided office space, staff, and funding for the March in Detroit and the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. He was the 7th speaker listed on the program and shared his remarks to the crowd. We will not solve education or housing or public accommodations as long as millions of Negroes are treated as second-class economic citizens and denied jobs, declared Walter Reuther, the legendary president of the United Auto Workers. This rally is not the end. It's the beginning of a great moral crusade to arouse America to the unfinished work of American democracy. Thus did he confidently link the goals of organized labor to those of the Black freedom struggle. In 1998, Time magazine included him in its list of builders and titans of the 20th century. Irving Bluestone, Reuther's former administrative assistant, shared this popular story to explain who Reuther was at the March on Washington. Standing close to the podium were 2 elderly women. As Reuther was introduced, one of the women was overheard asking her friend, "Who is Walter Reuther?" The response, "Walter Reuther, he's the white Martin Luther King." Number 5, not the first time he spoke of his dream. August 28 was the day that MLK's dream was immortalized. However, contrary to popular belief, it was far from the first time he uttered the words, "I have a dream." King in his immediate circles was known to employ the phrase time and again. He had used it just a week earlier in Chicago, just 2 months earlier at a rally in Detroit, and a dozen other times in the preceding year. The previous addresses where MLK had employed the dream phrase had been well received, but none of those were elevated to a legendary status. That is probably why some of King's close allies didn't want him to use the same speech again. Which brings me to Number 4, I Have a Dream almost didn't happen. The day before his speech, Dr. King had brought up the dream to his advisor, Reverend Wyatt T. Walker, who called it hackneyed and trite. So it is believed that when Martin Luther King Jr. took the podium, the text in his hand did not contain the words, "I have a dream." The actual draft had the working title, "Normalcy Never Again," and steered clear of any references to King's dreams. For the first 10 minutes of his address, King mostly stuck to the agreed-upon draft, which had some great points and was embellished by MLK's oratory. However, his words were far from historic yet. At this point, King decided to go off script. There are different versions of why he chose to go off script. According to King's friend and draft speechwriter Clarence B. Jones, that part was prompted by MLK's favorite gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, who was also on the platform. During one pause in the speech, Jackson shouted to him, "Tell them about the dream, Martin, tell them about the dream," and the rest is history. 3 months later, King himself addressed his decision to go off script. "I started out reading the speech, just all of a sudden. The audience response was wonderful that day. And all of a sudden this thing came to me that I'd used it many times before, the thing about I have a dream. And I just felt that I wanted to use it here." That part had become Dr. King's signature style. But did you know that the original speech was not entirely written by the man himself? Number 3. Who wrote the speech? The original speech had been in the works for weeks, and MLK had drafted it with the assistance of Stanley Levison and Clarence B. Jones in Riverdale, New York City. Jones later wrote that due to the burdensome nature of preparations for the march, the speech was not a priority. On the night before the march, King took the draft with him to his room to practice. According to some historians, that is also when King practiced the part about his dream. However, there are others who believe that it was completely improvised on the spot. Some parts of the I Have a Dream section were also inspired by addresses from the past. One famous passage about letting the freedom ring from mountains across the country was from a 1952 speech by Reverend Archibald Carey. Fun fact, the King family still owns the I Have a Dream speech. Though it is one of the most famous and widely celebrated speeches in U.S. history, the I Have a Dream speech is not in the public domain, but is protected by copyright, which is owned and enforced by King's heirs. As reported in the Washington Post, King himself obtained the rights a month after he gave the speech, when he sued 2 companies selling unauthorized copies. Though some parts of the speech may be used lawfully without approval, for example, individual teachers have been able to use the speech in their classrooms, the King estate requires anyone who wants to air the speech to pay for that right. Number 2. The speech wasn't universally appreciated. In the immediate aftermath of the event, observers lauded MLK's speech as the high point of the March on Washington. Millions today understandably believe that the speech instantly achieved legendary status. However, it must be said that not everyone was a fan. There were several critics, not least the legendary black nationalist Malcolm X himself. X scathingly described the march as a picnic and a circus. He went on to write an even more ruthless review. "Whoever heard of angry revolutionists swinging their bare feet together with their oppressor in lily pad park pools, with gospels and guitars and I Have a Dream speeches, all while the black masses in America were, and still are, having a nightmare." It is well documented that the speech and MLK's popularity soon began to erode. Number 1. The speech disappeared from public memory. One popular take away from the civil rights movement and the I Have a Dream speech is that it firmly established King as an undisputed hero. The reality is a bit different. In the months following his address, King's image changed drastically. He began an unsuccessful campaign to desegregate urban ghettos in the North. He also came out against the Vietnam War and lost powerful allies in the White House. This was followed by race riots from Los Angeles to Newark, and King's nonviolent tactics were considered out of date. In 1965, King lamented to an audience in Chicago, "I have had to watch my dream transform into a nightmare." Martin Luther King Jr. was even denounced as an extremist, and his iconic words were beginning to fade away. According to William P. Jones, author of The March on Washington, in 65 or 66, most people would not have said it was the most powerful speech ever. For many historians, it was King's murder that forced the world to rediscover the worth of that speech, rescuing it from oblivion. Today, a vast majority of Americans and history enthusiasts worldwide see Martin Luther King's speech as a watershed moment in the civil rights movement. In significance, it is considered on par with the Gettysburg Address or the Declaration of Independence. However, there is still a lot that we get wrong about that day and that address.